The coastal road along Ireland's wild Atlantic Way twisted and turned through rugged cliffs that plunged into the roaring Atlantic. Declan, a musician known for his soulful ballads and wandering spirit, was heading home after a modest gig in Dingle. His trusty guitar case sat in the back seat, its worn leather reflecting countless miles and stories. The road ahead was dark, lit only by his car's headlights and the occasional glimmer of the moon. The solitude suited him until he spotted the hitchhiker. The man stood on the side of the road, silhouetted against the distant sea. He wore a long, dark coat that flapped in the wind, his figure unnaturally still. Declan hesitated. Picking up strangers on these isolated roads was rare, but the man raised his hand, his thumb extended, and something in Declan compelled him to stop. He pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a lift?" Declan asked. The man nodded, his face hidden in shadow. "Just up the road." His voice was smooth, deep, and melodic, almost like a song. Declan unlocked the door and the hitchhiker climbed in. His face came into view, a pale complexion, sharp features, and eyes so dark they seemed to drink in the light. As they drove, the man didn't speak. He sat rigid, staring ahead, his hands resting motionless on his lap. Declan, trying to break the silence, asked, "Where exactly are you headed?" "Just up the road," the hitchhiker repeated, his tone unchanged. Declan nodded, glancing uneasily at the man. He turned on the radio to fill the silence, but it only emitted static. He flicked through stations. Static, more static, a brief burst of a distant song, then silence again. The hitchhiker began to hum. It was low at first, a simple tune that was oddly captivating. Declan frowned. It wasn't a melody he recognized, and as a musician that was rare. The hum grew louder, filling the car, weaving itself into the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt and the distant crash of waves. Declan finally spoke. "That's quite a tune. What is it?" The hitchhiker turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement, his lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. "It's your requiem." Declan chuckled nervously. "Requiem? Like a funeral song? You're joking, right?" The hitchhiker didn't respond. He simply returned his gaze to the road, the hum persisting, growing more complex, like a choir of voices layered upon one another. The air in the car thickened, growing cold. Declan glanced at the temperature gauge. It read normal, but he could see his breath misting. His fingers trembled on the steering wheel. "All right, seriously," Declan said, his voice shaking. "What's going on? Who are you?" The hitchhiker's head turned again, but this time his eyes were different, darker, deeper, as if they held an abyss within them. "You've already played your part," he said, his voice now layered with an otherworldly echo. The car hit a pothole, jolting Declan. He swore and slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. "Get out," he demanded, his voice rising. "I don't care where you're going. Get out of my car." He turned to the passenger seat, but it was empty. Declan's heart raced as he scanned the road, the cliffs, the vast expanse of ocean below. The hitchhiker was gone. Only the echo of the melody lingered, faint but persistent, carried by the wind. When Declan finally reached home, he locked his doors and poured himself a stiff drink. The events on the road replayed in his mind, each moment more surreal than the last. He convinced himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind after a long day. But as he unpacked his guitar, his breath caught. A piece of parchment was tucked inside the case, worn, yellowed, and edged with dark stains. On it, written in an elegant script, were the words, "Play the song, and you'll understand." Declan's hands shook as he read it. He didn't want to obey, but a compulsion stirred within him. Slowly, he picked up his guitar and began to play the melody from memory. As the notes filled the room, the air grew colder, the lights flickered, and shadows began to shift on the walls. The melody seemed alive, pulling at something deep within him. Images flashed in his mind, violent, vivid, and unrelenting. He saw his own car skidding off the coastal road, its tires screeching as it broke through the guardrail. He saw the ocean swallowing him whole, the freezing water silencing his screams. He saw his guitar floating in the wreckage, the strings severed like broken threads of fate. The music reached a crescendo, and with it, a deafening silence. Declan dropped the guitar, backing away as the room returned to stillness. His breaths came in ragged gasps. He didn't sleep that night, afraid of the dreams that might come. The next evening, Declan felt a compulsion to return to the coastal road. He drove with trembling hands, the melody still echoing in his mind. The cliffs were eerily silent, the waves muted. As he approached the bend where he'd picked up the hitchhiker, his headlights illuminated a figure standing the road. It was the hitchhiker. Declan slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. The man stood motionless, his eyes locking onto Declan's through the windshield. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the cliffs. Declan couldn't move. The car began to roll forward, as if pulled by an unseen force. The hitchhiker's humming filled the air again, louder this time, drowning out every other sound. The last thing Declan saw before the car plunged over the edge was the hitchhiker's face, watching from the cliff above, his haunting smile etched into the night. Days later, locals found the wreckage at the base of the cliffs. Declan's guitar was among the debris, its strings eerily intact. Rumors spread of a ghostly figure seen on the road, humming a tune that no one dared to follow. They say if you hear the melody, it's already too late. The dense forest of Oregon loomed like a dark cathedral, its towering trees casting long shadows over the narrow road. Bridget and Tom, a couple desperate to reconnect after months of strained silence, were returning to their rented cabin after a day of hiking. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and unspoken. "I told you we shouldn't have taken this road," Bridget said, clutching the map as the car's headlights barely pierced the thickening mist. Tom sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's a shortcut. We'll be back at the cabin in no time." The GPS had failed miles ago, leaving them reliant on the old, creased map Bridget had found in the glove box. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that gnawed at the nerves. Then they saw her, a figure standing at the side of the road. The woman was frail and bent, wrapped in a tattered shawl. Her silver hair caught the faint glow of the headlights. She held a small, battered suitcase and raised her hand, signaling for them to stop. Bridget tensed. "Tom, keep driving. This is creepy. She might need help," Tom replied, slowing the car despite Bridget's protests. As the car rolled to a stop, the woman approached. Her face came into view, gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to see through them. "Are you lost, ma'am?" Tom asked, forcing a smile. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I need a ride, just up the road." Bridget hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was off. But Tom, ever the good Samaritan, nodded. "All right, hop in." The woman climbed into the back seat, her suitcase on her lap. She smelled faintly of damp earth and decay, the scent filling the car as they resumed driving. For a while, no one spoke. The woman stared out the window, her fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern on her suitcase. Bridget couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air seemed colder now, and every creak of the car felt amplified. "Where are you headed?" Bridget finally asked, her voice betraying her unease. The woman didn't look at her. "Just up the road," she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, "Whatever you do, don't take the next left." Tom glanced at Bridget, raising an eyebrow. "What happens if we do?" The woman turned her gaze to him. Her hollow eyes seemed darker now, almost bottomless. "You won't come back," she said flatly. A chill ran down Bridget's spine. She opened her mouth to press further, but the woman returned to staring out the window, as if she'd already said too much. Minutes later, they reached a fork in the road. The right path was narrow and winding, barely visible through the fog. The left path was broader, straighter, and somehow inviting. "Tom, she said not to," Bridget began. "She's just a crazy old woman," Tom interrupted, turning left. Bridget's protest died in her throat as a wave of dread washed over her. At first, the road seemed ordinary, though the mist thickened unnaturally, swallowing the headlights. The trees lining the path were unnervingly uniform, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal hands. The air inside the car grew heavier, colder. Bridget glanced into the back seat to check on the woman, but it was empty. "Tom, stop the car," she cried. Tom slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching to a halt. He twisted around, his heart pounding. The back seat was empty, but the suitcase remained. "Where the hell did she go?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. Bridget leaned back and opened the suitcase with shaking hands. Inside was a single object, an old map, its edges frayed and yellowed. Scrawled across it in bold, blood-red letters were the words, "Turn back." Before they could react, a figure emerged from the mist ahead. It was the woman, standing exactly as she had when they first saw her. "That's impossible," Bridget whispered. Tom stepped on the gas, speeding past her. His heart raced as he gripped the wheel, the car tearing through the mist. But a few minutes later, she was there again. Same spot, same haunting gaze. No, 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 Tom muttered, his voice cracking. Bridget clutched the map, her knuckles white. This can't be real. This can't be happening. The loop began to wear on them. No matter how fast or far Tom drove, the road always brought them back to her. Each time she seemed closer, her hollow eyes boring into them. The mist pressed tighter, muffling even the sound of the engine. "Pull over," Bridget finally said, her voice shaking. "We have to stop." Tom obeyed, his hands trembling. They stepped out of the car into the suffocating fog. The woman's voice echoed around them, though she was nowhere to be seen. "I warned you," she whispered. "The left path keeps what it takes." Bridget turned toward the car and froze. The forest beyond the road was littered with rusted, abandoned vehicles. Their doors hung open, vines crawling over their frames. Faint whispers drifted from the trees, pleas for help, cries of terror. Tom grabbed Bridget's hand, pulling her back toward the car. "We have to go. Now." But when they turned, the car was gone. The mist thickened, pressing against them like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as shadowy figures began to emerge from the trees. One by one, they stepped forward, faces pale, eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. Among them was the woman, her skeletal hand pointing at Bridget and Tom. "You belong to the road now," she said, her voice echoing like a dirge. The last thing Bridget saw was the mist swallowing them whole, the shadows closing in as the woman's haunting gaze burned into her soul. Weeks later, hikers found the car abandoned at the fork in the road. The engine was cold, the doors wide open. Inside was an old suitcase containing a single map, the words "Don't take the left" scrawled in red ink. They say on foggy nights, if you stand at the fork, you can hear faint voices pleading for help, and the sound of footsteps that never seemed to reach the road.